Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. I have with me a very special guest, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, Ernesto Araujo, to talk about Brazil-India ties in the light of President Jair Bolsonaro's visit to India and also about regional and global issues of interest or concern to both Brasilia and New Delhi. Mr. Minister, thank you so much for making time to be on DD India. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Welcome. If I can dive straight into the India-Brazil ties, Mr. Minister, in the light of President Bolsonaro's visit, how would you describe contemporary Brazil-India ties, say in terms of trade and investments, people-to-people ties, and defense and security?
I think both of us are a key partner for each other.
Sure.
That's very clear now. We have similar goals, I think, of reaffirming ourselves as two great nations who want to be part of the shaping of the world in terms of democracy, freedom, but also prosperity, security.
Sure.
So you mentioned key areas in that partnership: prosperity, everything that has to do with trade and investment. We maybe in both countries tend to look at developed countries as our main partners,
right,
for that goal. We keep looking that way, but we have to look much more at each other, I think. Security, everything that has to do with feeling ourselves in safe neighborhoods, so to say,
sure,
in our regions. This is a challenge for us as well. And the whole agenda of coordinating our positions across the world in international fora. So whenever we look at the interests and values that we want to foster and defend, we see India at our side. So this is a very special partnership.
Mr. Minister, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a perception in India that when it comes to Latin America and Brazil in particular, from India's perspective, South America may fall in India's blind spot, in that sense that beside the geographical distance between India and Brazil, there also seems to be a psychological or a mental gap, so to speak, in terms of knowing about each other, in terms of people-to-people ties, culture, society. How do you intend to bridge this gap, and would the President's visit help bridge that gap going forward?
Yes, we have to raise much more awareness, I think, about each other, about culture in the broad sense. For example, we are signing agreements and a memorandum of understanding on traditional medicine. So we want to have more of Indian traditional Ayurveda medicine, for example, and yoga. This just to give a sense of
sure,
how things can merge in our relations. But also, as the President had previously announced, we are working towards facilitating visa-free entry for Indians in Brazil. This would, of course, be a big boost for tourism and for people-to-people exchanges. Those are examples of what we can do, but I think the visit itself will already raise awareness among people in Brazil regarding it. Of course, we know India is a big country, the economy is growing, but after people see the President here, right, and I'm pretty sure after tomorrow with the Independence Day celebrations, and this very special honor that the Indian government is making us and President Bolsonaro, this will, I think, bring this awareness to a new level.
Would you say that language might be a handicap, and could education or student exchanges help to foster that feeling of camaraderie and friendship between the two peoples?
Yes. Oh yes. That's for sure. That's a handicap that we have in terms of presence in the world. But people today in Brazil are, I think, becoming much more conscious that we are not an island, that we have to engage in the world in a different way, that we can not only receive, but we can bring our ideas and our identity, so to say, to the world. I think that's similar to India. One aspect that we are working with is we are creating a new institute for the promotion of Brazilian culture abroad, and for the teaching of Brazilian Portuguese. So I hope that in the near future this will be fully in place, and that would can have this presence in India. Of course, it's hard with such a huge country, such a huge population, but we think we can make a difference, and that this would allow people to go more into the grain of each other's culture. Of course, we have some general ideas, but it's so fantastic to be here and to feel this warmth toward Brazil, and I think this would create the atmosphere for also for people to be more interested for Brazilian culture here, all the complexity of our literature, I don't know, painting, dance, everything, and the same in Brazil.
You mentioned that Brazilians these days are increasingly becoming more aware of the world around them and that they are not an island unto themselves. So in that context, Mr. Minister, when Brazilians, an average Brazilian thinks about India, what do they relate to? I mean, if you ask an Indian today, he or she might talk about football, Brazilian footballers of past and present. They might talk about samba, they might talk about the Rio Carnival. But what about the average Brazilian? When they think about India, what comes to their mind?
I would say the first size of population. Of these people are very conscious, but I think they're still a little bit way back in terms of feeling the economic dynamism of India. I think people still perceive India as more, let's say, lukewarm growing country than it really is, and that it's clearly become. I think they also would see of course, the enormous depth, historical depth of Indian culture and civilization, but without much detail, right? Many people wouldn't know about all the richness of historical richness and cultural richness of India. People would think about maybe the temples or the dance, but I think they need to know more. I need to know more about India. Way back, I always was a fan of history of religions and different religions. I read a little bit about Hinduism, for example, as enormous, and all the Vedic tradition. So that's something that I think we'll pay more attention to, and it's incredibly rich and rewarding to study.
And Mr. Minister, have you had a chance to visit India before?
Yes. I was here around 2006 for the negotiations of what became the preferential Mercosur-India agreement with a few preferences that, by the way, we want to expand now. It's one of the goals that we have in our action plan, to expand a lot that agreement. But yes, I was here twice for those negotiations back then.
And how might have India changed between then and now? I mean, what's been your experience like?
Yes, of course, today is a very special moment. Sure. We're here, so it's hard to compare. But the feeling I have is that today people, they seem more prosperous. The country seems more dynamic. You see more growth. I don't know if it's very short to say that, but I think people are happier and more confident today here in India. Maybe I think that's the same in Brazil too.
Absolutely. Mr. Minister, talking about dynamism, we have two dynamic leaders in Brazil and India today, in President Bolsonaro and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, the two leaders seem to share a similar worldview. They are both pro-market, and they have their own ideas of where they want to see their respective countries in the years ahead. So talking about these two leaders, in your estimation, you've seen them work at close quarters. The two leaders have met twice already, at the G20 summit in Japan last year and the BRICS summit in Brasilia last year. How would you explain their chemistry or working relationship, Mr. Minister?
Yes, I think they share, they're very practical and result-oriented, and at the same time, they have a vision for their respective countries. And I think this reflects the fact that they both perceive a nation as something that is a whole, that you can't separate, let's say, economic growth from the rest of the society, from our identity, from our tradition. So I think both of them are proving with the good economic performance. Of course, India is already ahead in that process, but Brazil is beginning to grow very fast. They're proving that you can have a open, dynamic, efficient economy functioning in a society that is a true nation, where people feel that they belong together, that they're just not together by chance, that they have their traditions, their roots together. So I think they're converge in that vision, and also in, as I said, in their determination to do things.
Sure.
You know.
Mr. Minister, India and Brazil signed the Strategic Partnership Agreement in 2006. And what's the way forward in pushing that relationship forward in the sense of an action plan to implement those steps in the years to come?
Exactly. Well, I think the main thing is a follow-up process.
Right.
I was already talking with Minister Jaishankar, and we are planning a meeting in the maybe next 2 or 3 months, tops. Maybe before that, but certainly very shortly. To start the follow-up process. Of course, this involves so many agencies in both countries, but we are in charge of coordinating and pushing this forward. So lots of homework, I think, for both countries. But I think the secret is follow-up and keep regular contacts. Of course, we hope that President and Prime Minister keep having the opportunity to meet also on the side of G20 and other venues. This always helps to build and to maintain that momentum. But and also I think the secret is to keep the two things together: the vision and the practical side. And this we very much have from the talks I also had with Minister Jaishankar. We also saw that we converge a lot in our worldview, which is basically that of our leaders, of course. But we are very enthusiastic about this, very determined to work together.
So, Minister, besides trade, investment, and energy and agriculture, there's a fourth pillar of the relationship, that's defense and security. What have the two sides decided on this count? And also a related issue on terrorism. Now, terrorism, no country is immune from terrorism these days. And India views itself as a victim of terrorism emanating from its neighborhood. So what's Brazil's position on the issue of terrorism facing countries around the world as we speak?
Sure. That's a very important area for cooperation. We signed, for example, a memorandum on cybersecurity, which is a whole area of security that we have to pay, of course, much more attention to. Juridical and legal assistance in terms of fighting organized crime, for example, and other activities. We need much more of that in terms of coordination, exchange of information. This is in the pipeline, and already signing some important agreements in that direction. And this comes from the realization that, as you said, we face, to a large extent, common threats in fighting organized crime and fighting terrorism. This is maybe not a new reality, but there's a new awareness in Brazil about the presence of terrorism near us. Right? People wouldn't talk a lot about that, but now we see that it can be a threat in Latin America. We just last week we had a meeting of all the countries of the Americas for the fight against terrorism. That's already the third that we convene to exchange intelligence and other resources to fight terrorism. This is very interesting because many people in Brazil would deny that there's any threat like that, would deny that organized crime can have any, like drug trafficking, for example, can have any links with terrorism. And okay, we can see it that way, but the world doesn't work that way. It's very clear now. So, recently we had issued statements, and President has talked a lot about how important it is to fight terrorism with our partners across the globe. And it's in our constitution. The Brazilian constitution has a set of goals that our foreign policy has to obey. And one of them is the total repudiation of terrorism. And I used to say that, okay, repudiate is not only saying I don't like terrorism, but doing something about it, and doing something, as I said, in convergence and in cooperation with countries that have the similar values to ours. So for the future and survival of democracy, of freedom in our region, like I think in any region, we have to open our eyes and fight together that scourge.
Let's talk a bit about regional issues and issues of particular concern and interest to Brazil. Let's start with climate change. Now, that's a clear and present danger to many countries around the world, but what would be your view specifically about climate change? What's your take on this issue?
Yes. Well, climate change is a concern for so many people, so many countries nowadays. Brazil is very active in the discussions. We are a member of the Paris Agreement, and we want to keep all our commitments that we made, our national commitments and contribution to the Paris Agreement. In our case, this has to do basically with curbing deforestation. That's basically how we can best reduce emissions in Brazil, and also through biofuels and renewable energies. Brazil is one of the leaders in renewable energies. We also think that, and I think very strongly that that discussion has to be a rational discussion. I'm afraid that many times this is going off-road and becoming some sort of collective paranoia or hysteria. And this has to be addressed scientifically. Mm-hmm. Many people talk about the science of climate change, but sometimes don't want to hear scientists that have, let's say, different views about what's going on with the climate and the causes for climate change. So it's not, I hate the word denier, it's not being denier,
in
not
fact,
denier.
Mr. Minister, if I can quote what you said in your visit to the US last year.
Yes.
And this is what you said: there is no climate change catastrophe. From the debate that's going on, it would seem that the world is ending. The big threat facing Brazil and other countries is not climate change, but rather ideology. And you go on to say that lack of scientific proof over the causes of global warming exist. So is that still your position, Mr. Minister? Yeah,
there must be a rational democratic debate about that. I fear that many times people, including scientists, who entertain doubts about, let's say, the rhythm of climate change and the origin of climate change, especially the change in temperature, of course. Those people are demonized. So I don't think that's scientific. I mean, this debate should be allowed in a much more free way, I think, much more open way. Also, I stand by that opinion that it's very hard to talk about catastrophe or climate crisis today. That comes from reading.
Do you think the fears are exaggerated?
Yes, I think so. I think from reading the reports from IPCC, you don't see the same impression that there is a climate crisis as you see sometimes among politicians and in the media. And it's, I think, very obvious that sometimes this issue can be used for political and economic purposes. So if you have certain policy goals and they're hard to achieve, but then you say, no, there's a crisis and the world will end tomorrow if you don't follow my...
In other words, Mr. Minister, would you say that it is a hoax?
No, I wouldn't say a hoax, but I think it can be used. And don't say that it's always used. I think mostly it's well-intentioned people that have that sort of discussion. But it can be used to promote agendas that you wouldn't be able to promote otherwise. So if you use that sort of climate scare to control the world economy in a different way that it would work otherwise, then you start to see that there's something, there can be something to it in terms of political use of that issue. So personally, what I advocate for is scientific debate, open debate. I think societies shouldn't live, in our day, shouldn't live in a situation where you talk about imprisoning people who have entertained doubts about the science of climate change, for example. Sure. So that's basically it.
Sure. Mr. Minister, there's a related subject. That's the Amazon rainforest fire issue.
Yes.
what might be some of the lessons that the government of Brazil may have learned from this issue? And there's a lot of criticism of the way the government may have handled this issue. There's a commentary in the Brazilian media, for instance, which accuses the government of trying to go in for more development as opposed to protecting the environment, of going in for hydel dams in the Amazon rainforest, in terms of prioritizing development over the environment, and also opening up the protected or the reserved land for development purposes. So would you agree with those allegations or accusations?
No, I don't. First of all, if you look at the figures, and so important in this debate as well, as much as in climate change, to look at the figures in a cold and rational way. This last year, 2019, the number of fire occurrences was below the average for the last 20 years. From reading the press, you wouldn't have that impression, I would say. So, so that's the first thing. Why so much noise now? For political reasons. Because 15 years ago, different government was in place in Brazil, which was maybe more liked by the international media. Anyway, no one talked about that. Now, maybe they don't like our stance in so many areas, so they use this to
as a political tool to.
Oh yes, it was used a political tool, both domestically and internationally, I think. Sure. But we recognized, of course, we don't want the fires to be there. So, second thing, for the first time, we organized a huge action to combat the fire. So, the figures for August were high. I mean, on average, but high. Then, after we started that action, September was one of the lowest occurrences in September for a long time. So, and now we just created a council for the Amazon, which will be coordinated by the vice president, to organize the different agencies that have to do with the Amazon. So, also that's a first. Okay, so that shows that our commitment is stronger than previously. No piece of legislation was changed on the environment in Brazil by this administration, and we don't intend to in any case. Nothing that can be considered an incentive for deforestation. Sure. Nothing that can be considered either legislation or action that can be seen that way. That's a total wrong interpretation of what we think of and what we are doing. What is a strong point that we make is you need two things. You need protection, let's say classical protection, trying to and we have the legislation in place, so we have to enforce it. Right? But you also need to create alternatives for people who might be attracted to illegal activity in the Amazon. For example, illegal logging or illegal mining. It's not enough to just wall off areas. It's very difficult because it's such a huge region. You have 20 million people who live in the Brazilian Amazon. Those people need to make a living out of something. If they don't have good jobs, if they don't have ways of livelihood, what will we do? They will have this tendency to go towards illegal activities. So what we're working is towards sustainable development in the Amazon. One among many things we're doing is to create a fund with the Inter-American Development Bank to try to channel international investment to sustainable projects in the Amazon. I think we have spent too much money just on the, let's say, the classical protection, which is good, and not enough money in creating sustainable projects in things like ecotourism, things like projects around the biodiversity in the area. Some people say, well, we should invest in transforming the Amazon in some sort of green Silicon Valley, so creating, real opportunities for people. Of course, this will take time. So we're working on let's say, both fronts, and that's very clear.
Mr. One last question, and this has to do with your blog. I'm told that you maintain a blog which is called Metapolitics 17 Against Globalism. So I'm just curious to know how it came about, when and why, because if I can quote one excerpt from the blog, you say that globalism is the economic globalization that's been driven by cultural Marxism, and that is essentially anti-human and anti-Christian. If you could just give a sense to our viewers as to why this blog came about and when and why.
Yes. Well, I started it back in 2018 during the election campaign in Brazil, which was a moment where, because of the new message and the new project that President Bolsonaro, then a candidate, brought, people started to think and see things in a different way. At least some people. We realized that we had a system in Brazil, and that maybe reflected the system worldwide, where ideas were not discussed anymore, and you had, let's say, just a closed set of cliches that you have to follow and repeat. And this is part of what I call globalism. We could go on and on, but basically, my point is that after the fall of the Soviet Union and let's say the explicit socialist bloc, you had a survival of some of their ideas in different guise, and part of that lines of thought got hold of the process of globalization in order to foster their ideas, their values, and I think those things must be discussed. And in Brazil, there was, my blog was a very, very small part of a whole process, I think, of rebirth of, let's say, intellectual interest and intellectual activity in the country. People used to talk only about the economy, and the debate used to be only about, having more privatization or less privatization. Okay, that's okay.
In other words, your argument is there are limits to liberalism. Is that what your argument is?
No, it's more something that I talked about before when I talked about the commonality of vision between Prime Minister Modi and President Bolsonaro. Is that you don't have to conceive of a liberal economy as something that is can function in the void, in some sort of social void, when you have individuals that don't relate to each other and are just thrown together in a country. A liberal economy can function with, let's call it a conservative society, okay, just for lack of better terms. That you can have an open economy in a society that is a society that functions from its own identity, as I said, where people have a sense of belonging together, of being a part of a nation. I would say that countries should be nations and not customs territories, right? And for a long time, we had this sort of denationalization process as part of globalization. Not against globalization, but globalization, I think, lost its soul in a way, and was leading countries to lose their souls. And that's something that I personally think we should be against, because it's totally not only feasible, but I think the only way of having efficient economies in the long run is to have, let's say, societies that are where people trust each other and people like to live together, and not only a mass of scattered individuals. So that's at least part of what we try to develop there in that blog.
On that one, Mr. Minister, thank you so much for making time to speak to us at DD India. Appreciate it. Thank you.